Hello and welcome to Fortify. My name is Janine Mason. I'm the founder and executive director of the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego, and on behalf of our partners, the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego, I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar series today. This is an interesting and new week for us as we're doing a two-part presentation on Brené Brown's Dare to Lead. Fortify is a webinar series that was crafted in response to COVID-19. It was a wonderful opportunity for two organizations whose mission is to support nonprofit leadership in the San Diego area to come together. And the aim of Fortify is to strengthen the leadership, the well-being, and the sustainability of nonprofit leaders and their organizations. To help you to make the most of your experience, let me share some housekeeping tips with you. If you have any technical difficulties today, please feel free to email Cynthia. You'll see her address there on your screen, or you can also use the chat box and let her know if there's a way she can help you. Everyone on our webinar today is muted. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if we have resources, or if you have resources that you'd like to share with our community that's gathered today, please put those in the chat box. We will extend our webinar today for about 10 minutes to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to have their questions answered by Lorrie. So if you're able to stay with us for a few minutes after today, we will make sure that we get all of your questions answered. We are recording this webinar, and the recording and the resources that we talk about today and that you share with us will be added to the websites for both the Fieldstone Leadership Network and for the Nonprofit Institute. And both of those emails are on your screen. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Laura Dietrich. Laura is the Associate Director of the Nonprofit Institute, and she has been our partner in this effort. So Laura?
Thank you, Janine. So, with the welcome everybody to Fortify. Thank you, Janine, and the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego for your partnership in this important webinar series. Frankly, we have been listening to nonprofit leaders. We were one of the first in the nation to conduct a survey on regional leaders, and our focus is that on the needs of regional nonprofits. And you can flip to the next slide, Cynthia. When we have listened to you, we've done two waves of surveys, and thank you if you have participated in those surveys. We really appreciate it. We take the findings and then we tell absolutely as many people as we possibly can about what's on the minds and hearts of nonprofit leaders. So I promise the data do get used. We've reported to the media, directly to multiple elected officials in private sessions, to foundation leaders. So they should have a very clear understanding of what you folks are saying. And when we did that, there's a question in the survey that we asked about kind of what do you guys sort of need to get through and to persevere and to innovate and to feel whole during this time. And you can see some of the results of that. So we built the Fortify Webinar Series around those needs to directly respond to them. And, we are not on the front lines, but we're here to support those of you that are. And there's a component around all of this around resiliency, mental well-being, anxiety, and it's all the more timely because of what's been going on related to racism and to violence in our country right now, compounded by a worldwide pandemic. So all the more reason to really try to figure out how are we going to lead, right? How are we going to lead through this? Our leaders and nonprofits have been leading on the social justice front for decades. And I think that this is where folks are going to turn their hearts and minds to with a dearth of leadership everywhere else. So I'm so happy today that we can really talk about leadership. At the university, we're housed within the School of Leadership and Education Sciences. So everything we do has a leadership lens on it. And we are really fortunate to have my friend, my colleague, Dr. Lorrie Sulpizio, with us today to lead us through the Brene Brown framework, and just to talk through some conceptualizations of leadership that I think will bring healing and will bring hope to all of you. So Lorrie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Let me get a kind of a quick screen share going here, see if I can. Okay, so thumbs up if Janine, we got the screen all good?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I want to thank you for being here. I kind of just want to start by sort of giving you maybe a little background to what brought me to Dare to Lead. But first, Laura mentioned it, we're in a really, really interesting time. And I think we all know that this is a time that is unprecedented. I mean, it was unprecedented in the last couple months. And certainly now we've got a lot of tensions, social tensions that are on top of this. And I've been thinking over the last day or two really what is desperately needed. And I think we knew this before, but is good leadership. We need effective leadership. And unfortunately, the way that we have been practicing leadership up to this point is just not effective enough, right? It's not good enough. And we need new models, new paradigms, new ways of being. And so my hope for you all is that an introduction to the Dare to Lead program is going to be a step in a new, different way of leading. I came actually just as a kind of a quick in the chat, how many of you are familiar with Brene Brown and have read any of her work? If you can just throw down in the, okay. All right. So there's some familiarity. Great. Yeah, so I came to Brene back in like 2013 to 2012 when her vulnerability TED Talk kind of had really achieved a lot of exposure. And I was at the time going through a divorce. And if anybody's going through a divorce, you know, they're not fun. It's quite hard, quite difficult. And so this idea of vulnerability, being seen, living in the arena, very, very much spoke to me during that process. At the same time, though, I mean, so that was happening in my personal life. In my professional life, though, I had a PhD in leadership. I was doing a lot of women's leadership work. And so kind of this leadership part was sort of going along at the same time as my personal life was seemingly falling apart and getting put back together, right? And I resonated with the Dare to Lead, with the Daring Greatly work, even before she explicitly brought it to the leadership framework, because I thought that this idea of authenticity, being real, being true, being willing to have hard conversations is exactly what leadership is about. So when she then came out with Dare to Lead, I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect, right? This is sort of the perfect culmination of living and leading kind of rolled into one theory. And what's great about this theory, which we'll talk about in a bit, is that it is data driven, right? So this theory comes from the research. And that's, I think, a big strength of it as well. So my hope for you all is that, just so you know, this program, this Dare to Lead program, is a 25-hour program in its entirety. So obviously we're not going to get into it with that much depth. However, my hope is that in this hour together, this 50 minutes together, we can really discuss vulnerability, discuss courageous leadership, and hopefully I can get you to a place where you are open to and have a better understanding of what courageous leadership might look like for you, kind of for you in your life and in your world. And then we do have the next part coming on Friday. So with that, let's kind of get it going. So I want to say a little bit about kind of the time that we're in. You know, there are certain times, I think, maybe in our individual lives where we're faced with opportunity. We're faced with the ability to sort of look at our lives in new and different ways. And I'm guessing everybody here has had that at some point. You know, something happens in your life and you face your life. I think as a world, and certainly as a country, we are in that place, right? We are in a place where we can make some good hard decisions and hopefully change the way that we live, the way that we exist. That will be for the better for everybody. It is not going to be easy, and it is not an easy time. So the early on sessions I did around COVID was all about giving ourselves grace, working with leaders who are having to make huge, difficult decisions with very little information, and just reminding everybody that we need to give ourselves grace. We need to give ourselves some latitude. We need to give ourselves permission to make mistakes and kind of ask a lot of questions and be a learner while we're trying to be a leader. And I don't think that has changed at all. The other part with the time that we're in right now, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is one of the most critical aspects, I think, of the Dare to Lead work is the attention on fears and feelings. And so early on, if you are, even especially now, so even now with COVID continuing and with the tensions happening in our country, a great way to be effective with your team and your organization is to stop what you're doing and attend to the fears and feelings that are existing within your team, within your organization, and to have real, open, honest conversations. Because for everybody, fears are high, feelings are wide, and if we ignore them, they're going to come up anyway, right? So when we do this work, right, when we kind of learn to lead courageously, we actually do the work, meaning you can't learn about it without doing it, right? So I think one of the reasons why emotional intelligence, conscious leadership, courageous leadership maybe is sort of slow to get fully integrated into the corporate world is that it's really hard and messy. This is difficult, messy, uncomfortable work. Often emotions, especially the negative ones, aren't fun. And so we'd rather just not deal, right? We'd rather look at our numbers, crunch the budget, think about policy, put some new plans in place, and do a strategic plan, right? Let's do all these other things to sort of not dig into what's actually there with our fears and feelings. However, right now, as we can see, you look anywhere, turn on the television, look at your CNN news, fears and feelings are everywhere. So that's one big recommendation, which is if you take anything from this, the ability to tap in with your team, with your organization about what are the fears and the feelings that are present is going to go a very long way to creating a culture for then courageous leadership to follow. So some technical considerations. Usually the way that I facilitate and is very interactive, and so this is kind of a different model where we are all learning, but we have the chat. And so what I would love to say is we'll definitely have time for questions at the end, but if you have a question or a comment or a thought, you can throw it in the Q&A chat, and Janine will moderate for us and alert me. Please don't think that you need to wait until the end. Like if you interrupt me, and Janine knows, interrupt me at any time. If there's a question about some of the content, or just you want to share something, because I think it makes it a little more meaningful if we can engage with each other that way. So from a technical consideration, please ask questions in the open chat. Let's we'll try to engage with each other. I also would like you to have a pen, a pencil, and or paper or journal handy. So hopefully everybody has something to write with and write on, because we'll be doing a little bit of a reflection, and I'd like you to kind of take some notes down at certain points. Okay, so with that, right now, in the chat box, I would like, just take a moment, right? Take a moment, kind of take a breath, get yourself really connected. You gave yourself this hour, which is amazing with everything going on, early in the week, you're giving yourself this time. But what is one word that you are bringing with you right now? And if we could put it in the open chat, if I'm kind of understanding the system right, then I think we can all see it. So one word, it can be anything. There's no right answer. One word that reflects what you are bringing with you. Okay. On my end, actually, Janine, I'm not seeing. Oh, there we go. Okay. Great. Yeah. I mean, just scroll up and take a look at these words, you know, and I can resonate, you know, with stress, anxiety, grief. I can resonate with determination, understanding, alertness for sure. Yeah, patience. I've got 4 kids at home. Holy smokes. It has been a time of trying patience for sure. So when we look at this, we can see this sort of a very, we're assumingly a diverse group in terms of where we work, the amount of people that we work with, our ages even, and just look at sort of the collective energy. And so I want to just really, again, reiterate that your people, your clients, your stakeholders, the people, everybody is kind of feeling this, right? And if we don't at least find ways to acknowledge and attend to this, we are missing a big part of sort of anchoring to who we are and what we are bringing with us and holding. So thank you. Anger for sure, and heaviness. Yep, absolutely. And I agree with the strategy and focus. I think this is a great time to re-strategize and refocus our work. So Frank, absolutely with that too. Okay, so let's shift a little bit. So why daring leadership? You know, why daring leadership right now? What I love about this model is that this is a model that makes leadership accessible to anyone. One of the big problems with traditional leadership models is that it doesn't feel accessible to every person because traditionally, right, historically, leadership is something defined in very masculine terms. We started understanding leadership by looking at the great men. We call it the great man's theory, right? We have the generals and the presidents. So it was a model looked at war, right? We looked at the people that were leading into war. So not only was it men, white men, but also was men that were leading people through fighting. So there was aggression, and this idea of leadership that has transitioned into the corporate world kind of specifically has been relatively kind of inaccessible, right? Inaccessible to women, to people of color. And so this particular model now says, well, wait a minute, leadership isn't even about a position. You don't have to have a role to do this, right? There are 4 skill sets that you need to have that anybody can have. So this is an amazing model to develop youth to start being great leaders and to develop any industry, any person at any level. It really promotes authenticity and genuine connection, right? It promotes authenticity and genuine connection, which research shows when you look at kind of culture surveys for organizations in all sectors, what people really love and what leads to productivity is feeling connected to your work and to your colleagues, right? To your purpose and to people. So this promotes that. This facilitates the deeper, harder conversations. This facilitates ways to engage where we all can be more authentic and real. So it promotes that connection, which will then lead to a culture where we can be more productive, where we can deal with conflict in a healthier way. So it's a great model for that. It also attends to what's real, like we just talked about, right? Like it takes this list that you just put in the chat and says, we're not going to pretend like this isn't there, because then we're kind of cutting ourselves off from a huge part of who we are in this moment. And so we're going to take what's real. And if there's real conflict in our space, we are going to stop working on our budget and we're going to deal with this conflict. We're going to stop ignoring, we're going to stop deflecting, we're going to stop being in denial, and we're going to address what's real. And, okay, the best thing is it doesn't sacrifice strategy, efficiency, goals, right? In fact, it will enhance these things. One of the biggest pushbacks I get with the Conscious Leadership Academy, which is sort of my realm, I see your question. Yes, I'm going to come back to that question. One of the biggest kind of pushbacks I get is that, oh, you know, conscious leadership, taking a breath before we start, you know, getting centered, reflecting. We don't have time for that. We need to be making money. We need to be doing mergers. We need to be moving ourselves forward, the vision. Yes, right? Yes to that. And this model will help you with your vision, with strategy, but it'll do it in a way that clears out, like to quote Brene, that speaks truth to bullshit. And it clears out the BS so we can actually do the real work we all want to do. I'm going to get to the diversity part, and maybe we can come back to that at the end, but I think there are ways that this will help, because what this model does is it helps us deal with shame. It helps us deal with triggers. And I think for all folks, I'm only going to speak sort of kind of maybe from my own perspective, but so as a white woman, as a white lesbian woman, as a mom, kind of all of my identities, there are moments where I do have shame and or triggers around race, even understanding my own. And this model helps us learn how to deal with our shame, move through our shame. And I think in order to face our shame, then we can attempt to kind of move away from some of these structures that are very racist. There's the kind of racist structures that we have, and having harder conversations. So I think it does, actually. I think it does. Here we go, right? My next one, perfect timing. It honors diversity. It really, and we'll get to kind of how and why, because it's not a model that is built upon traditional leadership, which again is founded on looking at white, straight, male generals and presidents. Very, very small population. Many of us don't exist that way. We don't lead that way. We don't think that way. And so having a model of leadership that is that kind of takes a lot of us out of the equation. This says, no, let's open it up, right? So it's masculine, feminine equally, diversity equally, all sectors equally, right? It can be used anywhere, widespread relevance. So really great. And when it gets hard, my hope is that I put this slide up here because when this gets hard, and it will, that you will come back to the many reasons why this is such a great model and all the ways that it can help. Okay, I want to give a little bit because I think people, research-based, data-driven stuff still drives us, right? We want to know. So I want to share with you a little bit about this because so she did 2 decades of research on Daring Greatly. She's a shame researcher, shame and vulnerability, right? And the last 10 years have been focused on leadership. And so Brene has worked with everybody from Disney and Pixar to the Silicon Valley, kind of big tech companies, and Google to LinkedIn to the military, I mean, right? Special forces, across the board, and took this idea of how do we take wholehearted living and being in the arena, which is from Daring Greatly, and translate it into the workplace, because we spend so much of our time at work, in our work. So if we want to be wholehearted, if we want to live kind of an authentic life, we can't, we have to include work in some way. So how do we do that? That was a question that she set out to ask. And so the research really started with vulnerability and shame as a way to get to authenticity, right? Kind of as a way to get to this piece of authentic leader. And, authenticity and leadership maybe is somewhat of a kind of a buzzword, and maybe the horse has been kind of, beaten to death on this one, but it still is very important. Knowing yourself, knowing who you are, knowing your kind of relationship to vulnerability and shame is going to help you be a better leader. So she recognized this and said, okay, well, let's translate this. And she has her Roosevelt quote, which talks about it's not the critic who counts, right? It's not the person on the side looking at the man or woman who is marred by blood, marred with tears. It is the person who is actually in the arena, who is failing time and time again and continues to get up. And this isn't the actual quote, you can Google it. And who, if he errs or she errs, does it at least daring greatly, right? So meaning that, yes, it's the person who is getting up and failing, getting knocked down, getting up and failing, getting knocked down. It's not the critic, right? And this is, I think, going to be becoming really pivotal to remember this as we dig into this work, because there will be criticism if you attempt to do this within your organization. So a couple things, a couple kind of assumptions that I want you to just keep in mind as you hear sort of we get into the model and as you try this in your life, okay? Number 1, living in the arena, right? The arena is that metaphor for coming in, being wholehearted, being true, being authentic, living courageously. When you do that and you're brave with your life and brave with your work, you're going to get your ass kicked. You are going to fail. So it's funny because then we'll do this in with admin teams and C-suites, and they'll say, okay, yeah, I'm all about this. I am willing to fail. We will do this. And, we're willing to fail. It's like, no, you didn't hear. You didn't hear me. It's not a willingness to fail. It's you are going to fail, right? You are going to fail. That's why rising strong is the 4th pillar in this model. Because if you do this, you are going to make mistakes and fail. So you need to know how to rise, right? The rising part is just as critical as the risk. because we want to take risks. We want to be real. When we fail, how do we get back up? How do we recover? And so you are going to fail. You have to know that. Number 2, vulnerability is not weakness. It perhaps is the most accurate measure of courage, right? It's this willingness to show up and be seen for who you truly are, for who your organization truly is, for your individual teams. It is not a weakness. And then finally, and this is an important one too, which is really great, is if you're not also in the arena, I'm not interested in what you have to say. I am not interested in your feedback or your criticism. And think about, if everybody were to take a moment right now and think about the people in your lives, right? And the people that give you feedback, right? And maybe criticize you or always have something to say. Maybe it's a sibling, right? Maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a friend, who knows? Maybe it's a spouse, right? But there's somebody, maybe it's a colleague, and they're always just having something to say, but you're living, taking risks, trying hard, making mistakes, and they're not. At some point, the learning part of the rising process is to turn those voices off. To say, I am more than happy to listen to you give me hard feedback if you are also being brave with your life. Because then I know that you are coming at me with good intention for us both to be the best that we can be. If you have some other agenda, if you've got some other, intention, no thanks, take that somewhere else. I really don't care what you have to say about me, right? And this is important. It's important a little bit to get some thickness to our skin, because when you start living and leading this way, there will be some pushback and criticism because it's not the norm. It's still not the norm in our cultures. Right? Okay, so we looked at daring greatly. Everybody was taking to this idea of vulnerability and wholehearted living, and yes to this, and yes to this at home, and wow, we want to do this at work. So what does it look like? What does this look like doing it at work? What does this look like at leaders? That was the question that led to the Dare to Lead model. And she has been saying all along, and it's so relevant now, all the facilitators were just on a call last Friday about bringing diversity, true issues of diversity, inclusion, belonging into our leadership work. The future of leadership, right? Who will still be standing in 5-10 years? They're going to be the brave leaders that foster courageous cultures that will start to combat some of these systemic kind of inequities that we have facing ourselves. Whether it's Me Too, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whatever it is, right? We need brave leaders, because as we are seeing our system, we have a metaphor of a pressure cooker. And if you can picture in the kitchen, your pressure cooker, and pressure is going so great, the pressure's so high, the top is gonna blow. We are very close to that, right? If we haven't blown already. So we need leaders that are going to help us through this part, right? This is the critical work of leadership right now. So the question is okay, so courageous leaders, great. Well, what even is a leader, right? There's so many pieces. How can we start to define a leader and leadership in order to understand what we're talking about when we start talking about how to do it well? Okay, so a couple definitions. Her definition in the book would be anyone who holds themselves responsible for finding the potential in people and processes and has the courage to develop that potential. Anyone who holds themselves responsible for developing potential. You don't have to have a role. You don't have to have a big corner office with a nice window. You just need to have some responsibility for developing the potential of the people around you, of your processes, of your work. And so this again, really great definition of leader, because it takes it away from saying, oh, I'm not a leader, I'm not a boss, I'm not a leader, I don't have direct reports. You don't have to, right? You don't have to. We can start kind of authorizing everybody to start doing leadership. It's saying, I see what's possible, and I'm going to hold myself, my team, my organization accountable for doing it. And I think the COVID time, this time, there we see possibilities. The question is, are we going to be willing to hold ourselves accountable for doing it? Because it's not going to be easy, right? This is the courage part. This is the learning to rise part. The third one, and this definition comes more from our work in the Department of Leadership Studies, where we see leadership also as somebody, a leader who is willing to address the problems that don't have a clear, easy, quick answer, right? We call these adaptive challenges. And we distinguish adaptive work from technical work. Adaptive work addresses adaptive challenges, the problems that don't have an answer. Technical work addresses technical challenges. Those problems have an answer. Now, I'm going to be the first to tell you, technical challenges and technical work is real and important. And there's a whole discipline for that. It's called management, right? Management, protection, direction, control, order, all about addressing problems that we kind of have answers to. Managing people, managing structures, managing policies. When things start to get a little more ambiguous and abstract without a clear answer, that's when we need leadership. So if we were in a room together and there was a fire, right, and we were doing this presentation, that's a problem. We just need management. We need to get our stuff, find the exit, make everybody safe, right? That's one part. A problem that doesn't have, and usually if we were in a room, I would ask, give me an example of an adaptive challenge, right? And feel free to put it in the chat if you have one, right? Give me an example of a problem that doesn't have a clear answer. We're seeing a huge one right now, which is the issue of race, right? Race, equity, that does not have a clear answer. Healthcare doesn't have a clear answer, right? Climate change, right? We don't know, so this is the part. And when we don't know, some of these are great. Yeah, these are really great examples. We get kind of in this paralysis and we become critical of any possible solution. We don't have the hard conversations. We're unwilling to try. So this is a model that says, let's try to address it. Let's try. We can try and then change, right? We can pivot, we can learn, but let's at least try. So that's the leader definition and leadership definition that this model holds at its core. So then we say, okay, so that's leader. What's a brave leader, right? And she went to all these leaders and said, well, tell me when you learned to be brave. Tell me when you learned to be courageous. And all the leaders said, well, I don't even know when I learned it. I can't even pinpoint it. And so the research was coming up flat. So she shifted the question and said, well, tell me then what happens in the absence of leadership, of brave leadership. When there's not brave leadership, what do you notice? And she started from that place, from that research question, and she got this really great list of the barriers to courage. These things here are the barriers to courageous leadership, right? They're things that are not having tough conversations, hiding from conversations, not attending to fears and feelings. When you have cultures and teams that corrode trust, when you're stuck in setbacks because you're unwilling to learn or change, when you have no innovation, problem solving and bias, right? That these diversity, equity and inclusion, shame and blame, gauzy, unclear values, and perfectionism. These are the things that happen in cultures and organizations that are not courageous, that don't have brave leadership. Unfortunately, and again, I often would ask for everybody, raise your hand if there's at least 2 or 3 of these that exist within your organization, and inevitably everybody raises their hand. They can all point to 2, sometimes more on this list that characterizes their organization. And it just goes to show us that we don't have courageous, brave organizations because we don't have brave, courageous leadership, because it's really difficult again. So noticing that these are the barriers to courage, it's okay, well, then how do we do it? What's the skill set? What's the practice, right? Here they are. There's 4 skill sets, 4 things to do to help you become a more courageous leader. Number 1, rumble with vulnerability. Number 2, live into your values. Number 3, braving trust, develop true, lasting trust. And then the 4th one, learn to rise. Because when you do the first 3 and you hold your people accountable and you actually, we'll probably do values on Friday. So when you get your values and operationalize them and you hold people accountable when they're not living and acting in the way, it's going to get messy. So you're going to have to learn to rise. So these 4 things, measurable, operational, data-driven, is what constitutes the 4 skill sets of courage and is the cornerstone for daring leadership. Now, again, to really unpack all these and to learn them and the skill sets, it's 25 hours worth of content. And it is a really fun certification. So maybe that's something we can think about offering in its entirety. But just know you can probably start to think enough like, okay, well, if I were to, kind of live into my values, it would look like this. If I were to focus on being more vulnerable, for me, it would look like this. My hope is that you've all been in organizations enough and maybe been exposed to her work enough that you can at least get in touch with some of these and what they would mean for you. Okay, so now she talks about how we can lean into courage, how we can decide maybe where our first place where we need to grow, right? What is that first step to becoming a courageous leadership? So it's the Joseph Campbell quote that she uses, which is, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek." And the example that she gives is Empire Strikes Back, right? When Yoda takes Luke into the Force, and for nobody who's Star Wars fans, can bear with me, but Luke Skywalker is the young Jedi being trained by Yoda, the Jedi Master. I think everybody probably knows that. And he goes into this forest to train, and he has to enter a cave, and Yoda can't enter with him. So he goes into this cave, and what does he see? He sees Darth Vader, right? And he sees, when the mask comes up, he sees himself as Vader, right? And so it's this idea that what we fear, what we don't want to see, that's where our treasure is. That's where growth lies. Okay? She talks about how she's been in corner suites, the highest floor, most beautiful offices, and not seen a leader anywhere, and then goes down to the bottom warehouse floor and is surrounded by leaders. So truly, this is not about role. This is about you embracing this practice. So what I would like you to do in your papers, and I'm going to set my time, I'll give you about 2 minutes or so. What would be your call to courage? If you were to think about, and you right now, you can do it a personal call to courage, you can do a professional call to courage. Since we're all working from home, there's very little blend. What would be your call to courage in terms of entering a cave and maybe seeing that piece that you are a little afraid to see? Take a moment and just kind of write about it. Journal it down. And if anybody is interested or willing or wanting to share, okay, does not being good enough fit this? Yeah, so let me think. So so you think your call to courage is you feel like you're being misunderstood by your people? Is that what we're talking about? I'm curious to kind of understand that better, but let me give you an example. So when I first kind of started doing this work, what my call to courage was existing deeper into my heart. I am very much a head person. I am great in my head. I am a quick thinker and a quick speaker from my head, but dropping into my heart was not where I existed with a lot of comfort. I'm an ENTJ, if you know Myers-Briggs. I am T through and through. There's very little F, I think, in me, which is the feeling, right? I'm the thinker. And so I had to really embrace not just the letting the feeling be in me, but valuing it, right? Valuing it in the space as something legit and worthwhile. And now, kind of I'm all about it. So I have a new cave, right? So as soon as we enter one cave, another one shows up, but that's the type of thing. So yeah, so let me think. Yes, so your cave would be maybe a confidence, right? Feeling like you don't have a seat at the table. So your call to courage might be sort of addressing whatever shame and or story in your head that tells you you don't deserve a seat at the table, and working that, and then finding a way to own that confidence to say, yes, I do, right? To find your worthiness. So this cave example would be about worthiness, right? My cave is finding my worthiness at any table, right? Great example. Yeah, another great one. Yeah, so your cave is, putting myself out there. for people to judge, and then knowing, here's the thing, right? This is going to help you. If they're judging you from what we call the cheap seats in the arena, you know, from the box seats where they just pay to get a box and fancy food, but they're not doing, you know, anything, then okay, let them judge, right? Judge away, because it doesn't penetrate me. What hurts me is when somebody that I love and care about gives me hard feedback. It doesn't hurt that they gave the feedback, but it's like, ooh, that stings. Yes, I know I got to do that better, right? It stings a little, but I can take it. The people that judge but know nothing about me and also aren't living in the arena, judge away, you know, go do your thing. So hopefully we can get to that place, right? Great one. Accepting failure. That's great. The rise, right? So accepting failure and then learning to rise. So super great. These are great examples. Yeah. So, you know, you want to be thinking about how this model can then help you with your kind of entering that cave and addressing that call to courage. And a lot of this, and we're not going to dig into shame because we can't dig into shame in this format. But for everything that I've seen, it would be really starting to unpack where shame sits with all of those things. Where does shame show up with my ability to be seen? Where is shame showing up with my ability to believe I have a seat at the table, right? And that's where we would start. Really great. Thank you, everybody. Oh,
Lorrie, can I just jump in?
Yeah. I'm noticing. Go ahead.
It looks like a lot of our guests today have your chat set up only for your comments to come to the panelists. So while Lorrie is able to see your comments, the rest of the group gathered together today cannot see your comments. So if it's not making sense what Lorrie's responding to, it's because you're not seeing those comments in your chat. So if all of you who are participating in the chat feature could make sure that you go to that drop-down menu and make sure that you have it clicked all attendees and all panelists, then that way everybody will be able to see the responses and be able to understand Lorrie's comments back to those.
Thank you. Perfect. I was kind of tracking it and wondering. There we go. Now I see people. So it's great. Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. If you have any questions or any challenges with that, just write it in chat. We'll try to help you from behind the scenes.
Perfect. Okay. So we've got our call to courage and now we're ready to do it, right? We're ready to dig in. So a couple things again, right? You cannot get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. Embrace the suck, right? This is the part that is going to honor, this is hard. This is going to be a messy middle. It is going to suck. And this is a kind of a fun story. It came from when Brene was working with special forces, I think at maybe West Point or Kings Point or something. And she spent a lot of time with these military officers, and she really pushed them and made them do a lot of good hard work. And at the end, when she was going to leave, one of the officers came and said, "Hey, ma'am, you know, we're going to do a 5K, you know, and when you come back, let's do the 5K with us, ma'am." And she was like, no, I don't, thank you. That's super fun, but I don't run. And then she thought about it and said, hey, you know, I've asked these people to really push to their edge. Like, can run a 5K. So she started to run the 5K and train. And she said she got like 15 feet of a few steps of running and said, yeah, no, I'm not doing it. I don't run. And so, you know, she kept trying. And then she finally talked to this officer on the phone. And she said, I just can't do it. I cannot do it. It's hard. It hurts. And he said, ma'am, you just got to embrace the suck. It's going to suck. You got to embrace the suck. Know at the end when you're done, it's going to feel great. And that really resonated. And I think I come from athletics, right? An athletic background. So I can certainly resonate with certain things to get to the end result that feels so good. It really does suck. It's hard, right? Training, getting in shape, you know, working, doing your budget and making budget cuts. I mean, that stinks. It's hard, right? It's hard and it is vulnerable making. So we've got to be willing to embrace the suck, get comfortable with discomfort, right? Get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I'm sure you've heard that before because it's somewhat of a common idiom now, but it's so important. It is so important. And once we kind of embrace it and expect it, all of a sudden it's a little easier, right? It's a little easier to manage it and deal with it when it comes. I love this one, right? Who we are is how we lead, period. Who you are is how you lead. That's it. Self-awareness and self-love really matter. You know, I've coached enough and worked with enough leaders now that I can usually after maybe 1 hour session of hearing somebody speak, start to know what their triggers are going to be, where their strengths are, and where they have some blind spots, because you see who you are, right? And you can start to know right away, that is how you lead. So if you don't start by bettering yourself, really digging into your own place, I don't care how many seminars that you do on leadership, how many conferences you go to give you this toolkit or this notebook that's probably going to sit in your desk and collect dust, in your bookshelf a year later. If you don't dig into yourself and really do that individual work and get clear on some of the things that are happening in you, it's not going to matter. You're not going to improve the leadership. So digging in at first and starting with the self will then help you engage with the others, with the group, and then the system, right? So we have this model of self, other, system, and it kind of gets bigger from there. But if you don't do the self work, you can do as much system and other work as you want. It's not going to matter. And I think we're seeing that, right? We're seeing some parts of that. This one's a good one, right? Courage is contagious. Courage is contagious. And all we need is a critical mass, right? In your team, in your organization. So we must cultivate a culture where brave work, tough conversations, and whole hearts are the expectation, right? Living into our values is what's expected. It's not above and beyond. It's just what we do. And then we can figure out how we can go above and beyond. But this is the baseline. And in too many organizations, it's just not, right? It's just not. So courage is contagious. At the beginning of COVID, I worked with a lot of leaders and shared, panic is contagious too, right? So if we panic, if we are toxic leaders, that is going to spread. So again, who you are is how you lead. Who you are will be spread out. If you are the leader of that organization, is going to be spread out with your team. And it really does. It's like, okay, this is good news, right? We can do a shift. It might take some time, but it's available for us. Okay. So a couple questions for you to think about with each of the 4 pillars. So can you rumble with vulnerability? And just, think about this and reflect for yourself. Are you one to stay in tough conversations? Think about your family, right? Was your family one? Did your parents sit down and have open, kind of real conversations about feelings? Did you and your siblings kind of like truly say when each other hurt each other's feelings or disappointed each other? Did you do that with your friends? Did your first job? Probably not. We don't have a lot of history with this. So the learning is rumbling with vulnerability to stay in those conversations and not tap out when it gets awkward. Can we stay in there? Can we hang in there? That would be a big first skill. Do you have values clearly defined, and are they operationalized? And we're going to dig into this one on Friday. For those of you, hopefully you're all going to join on Friday. But so here, example, family is a value. I have family value. What does that mean, right? What does it mean to have family as a value? What does it look like? It means calling my parents once a week. It means Zooming with my Costa Rica family once a month. It means reading, but whatever it means, get behavioral. Because if you just have values on the wall, right, on a poster, it's not going to translate, right? We've got to get behavioral. Trust is a big one, right? Can you build trust and be trustworthy? And there's a whole unit on that. And then finally, learn to rise, right? We are willing to be courageous if we know that we can get up when we get knocked down. And so that rising strong skill is a big one. So these would be sort of the 4 pieces that then you can ask yourself and about your organization. Where in my organization might we need the most work right now? Should we clarify our values? Do we need to work on trust? Are we really good with this, but then do we fail to kind of learn how to get ourselves back up after we kind of hit a conflict? Maybe we need to polish our rising skills a bit. So again, getting clear, getting honest is going to help you know what steps to take with you and with your organization. So for the first one, okay, rumbling with vulnerability. Nobody loves vulnerability, right? And I get it, right? Vulnerability is marked with shame, scarcity, fear, anxiety, right? These are not fun, right? Taking a risk, possibly failing, going for a job interview that you may not get. It's uncertain, it's anxious. I mean, it's vulnerable making, and we don't like it. So we numb, right? We are the most numbed generation, kind of living generations across, living at one time. We over-medicate, we gamble, we eat, we shop. I mean, it is just, we drink. So mental health is kind of in a crisis mode. because we don't want to face these things. We don't want to face our fears and our anxieties. We don't want to live in uncertainty. In fact, you know, I can't tell you how many, and they've been really funny, but how many of you have gotten a ton of little, you know, gifs and memes on chats with your friends about, you know, coffee kind of handing over the baton to wine, or is it too early to drink at 10 a.m. right now in this COVID time? Because we don't know what to do, right? We're in such fear and anxiety and uncertainty. Well, let's just have a drink. Might as well, we're home. So we numb, right? We numb instead. Here's the clincher though. When we numb these, we also numb the above. So if we are going to numb anxiety and fear, you're also going to numb and prevent belonging, joy, love, productivity, happiness, any of the positives. We all know, and I think we've heard the idea that, you know, to truly fall in love is probably the most vulnerable thing, because if your heart gets broken, I'm not sure there's much that hurts as much as that, right? A broken heart may hurt the worst. And so instead we may protect ourselves. We may not give ourselves wholeheartedly to love even our job, let alone, I mean, think about it as a spouse, as friends, as love your job, because you just don't want to be heartbroken by it. But then we never quite get that full potential for the joy, the connection, all the good. So instead of saying like, well, okay, I'm just going to mitigate. I'll have a little shame and a little scarcity, and then I can have a little joy, and I can just make it enough. How about we just learn how to embrace all of this in a way that's healthy for us, right? And how does this show up in the workplace then? I can't imagine any example of getting to any of these words on the left, courage, empathy, trust, that doesn't include vulnerability, right? There is no creativity without vulnerability, because think about how, if I were to say, okay, everybody, you know, we're going to unmute you and we're all going to sing one at a time, you'd probably like end call, right? I want you to draw something and show it, right? Being creative is really vulnerable, right? It involves risks, adapting to something, leaving something behind. It's vulnerable. I ask this every time, if anybody can give me legitimate example of one of the things on the left that doesn't involve vulnerability, like when this is over, I'll take you out and we'll have breakfast together, right? There's just no way. We cannot get to the list on the left without fully embracing both parts of the list on the right. And so that's why learning to be vulnerable is so important, and getting courageous, vulnerable workplaces is important, because we want accountability, we want innovation, we want all these things, and this is the way to get that. So, okay, if vulnerability is the key to brave leadership, right? Like, oh, I see that. That seems to make sense. What do you think gets in the way? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. Make sure it's to all panelists and attendees. When we ask leaders, what do you think? What gets in the way? Your experience of leaders: fear, ego, pride. Lots of ego. Yeah, good. Ignorance. Yep, great. Fear again. Yeah, so a lot of people said fear and ego. That's really great. Fear was the number one answer, right? And people said, well, that's what it is. People are afraid. And here's when she asked high-level leaders, everybody from looking at, you know, kind of the Gandhis and the kind of Mother Teresas to the Silicon Valley leaders, they say, I'm afraid all the time. Big decision, a new kind of product, or shifting I'm afraid all the time. So fear doesn't get in the way. What gets in the way is armor, right? And that's close. Yeah, getting hurt, armor, right? We armor up to protect ourselves from possibly feeling the shame, the embarrassment, the resentment that leads to shame. And we don't want that feeling. So we armor and we protect. And we don't want to have our true selves shown, because that would be really, really risky and vulnerable. But here's the thing, right? So here's the armored knight. Really what we're armoring is our heart, right? We are protecting our heart because we don't have the skills to really deal with the complexity of our own emotions and others' emotions and put them in the context of the work we're trying to do. So instead we protect, I don't care what they say. I don't care, right? When we really do care. Janine, I see you. Did you want to?
Yeah, we have a question that says,
great.
I'm in social services. How do you navigate vulnerability in leadership with acceptable and necessary boundaries?
Yeah, boundaries are a great question. And one of the ways, so boundaries is defined, what's okay and what's not okay, right? So if we take, boundaries, and if I've said, okay, we're going to be vulnerable, we're going to live courageously, but we want boundaries, right? So it looks like defining, this is what's okay here, and this is what's not okay. So maybe you need to give me a bit more of a specific question, like an example, but with values, right? Our value is to respect each other. The way that we operationalize that is we talk to each other, not about each other, right? When we have an issue in a meeting, we kind of say we are direct with each other. We don't have behaviors that would otherwise show discontent without naming it. So in a meeting, right, someone's kind of rolls their eyes and slams their hand on the table or crosses their arms and looks away and checks out. That moment, that could be a boundary issue, and you say, you know what, we don't do that. Our value is to talk to each other, not about each other. What do you need to say? Because you're clearly upset right now. And so you can have boundaries if you have the guidelines, the values, and the behaviors already outlined. You can have boundaries if you've clearly kind of designated this is the culture we're going to have. Does that make sense? We can talk a little bit more about it too if you have a specific question about boundaries, but it's really saying, I'm not okay with this behavior. I'm leading this meeting. That's not okay with me. Right? Yeah, great. Manoush, great question. It's true. Vulnerability is not acceptable at so many workplaces, right? And the staff cannot go against the culture. And Manoush, you want to say, change your thing to all panelists and attendees. But that's what she wrote, is that it's not acceptable. Yes to the staff. I understand it's hard with staff. Here's what I would suggest, right? Find an ally. Find an ally, find enough staff allies, become a critical mass, find ways to do this that feels pushing enough without blowing the pressure off the pressure cooker, right? Because you definitely don't want to blow the pressure off the pressure cooker, but you can certainly push back. Maybe there is a leader, somebody who's in a role of authority, that you can go to who could become an ally and could help. Right? Maybe there's a way to have a conversation about with your leadership team about maybe shifting your culture a little bit. The thing is there's a slide that I have for Friday that says, in the absence of data, we make up stories, right? The whole Rising Strong process is about the story I'm telling myself, because we craft a story in our head, and often it's either a story that is sort of negative to us. I'm such a failure. I'm never going to get it right. I knew they didn't like me. Or it's a story that's a failure about our organization or our leaders. They're so stupid. They don't understand us. They only care about money. And we really don't know because we haven't checked it out. So the courageous leader would go and say, or even the courageous staff member who's practicing leadership would say to your boss or hey, I really, I've been learning about this Dare to Lead courageous leadership model. I'm wondering if we might be more, if we could work on becoming more open, or whatever the issue is that you would need to do, right? Kind of find that. Okay. Really quick, last one I want to kind of end with, and then we'll go to questions. Part of the thing with vulnerability is there's a bunch of myths, and I'm going to put them all up. And I want you to think about sort of what we would do in the session is you would rate from 1 to 5 how much you need to unlearn each of these. So vulnerability is weakness. How much unlearning do you need to do to get rid of that myth? I don't do vulnerability. I'm good, right? This is a huge one I can go it alone. I don't need anybody. I can go it alone. I've been going alone since I was 16, right? Like, I'm going to do vulnerability, but we're going to have this hard conversation, but it's not going to be, hard. We're going to just kind of keep it comfortable. Not true. It's going to be uncomfortable. Trust comes before vulnerability. Not true either, right? Sometimes I have to be vulnerable for you to trust me. And then once you trust me, you'll be more vulnerable. It's mutual. Vulnerability is disclosure. It's not, right? Vulnerability is not kind of barfing up every kind of trauma that you've had in your life, but it's being true and authentic and intentional about showing your real self and addressing what's real in the space. And then finally, this idea that systemic vulnerability is the same thing as relational vulnerability. It's not. We're not saying, let's have vulnerable, water systems or IT systems so the internet crashes. It's not vulnerability in that sense. It's vulnerability in the sense of being relational. So as I leave you and as we finish, I really want you to think about, kind of start with these 7 myths, because it's a great place to start to say, where do I need to do some unlearning and where can I relearn to be more courageous? We're going to go through and I'm going to say, if you want more, would love to connect. If you want to take a picture of this, I'm sure, with the Nonprofit Institute, the CLA is within the Nonprofit Institute, but if you have extra questions, I would be happy to kind of talk with you offline, set up a call, because I do love this stuff. I think it's very important. And the more leaders that we can get doing this and practicing it, I think that the better off we're going to be in so many ways. So with that, I will stop and maybe take some questions.
Great. Thank you, Lorrie. This was just fabulous. I want to acknowledge to all of you that I know we're up against a time boundary. We have just one question that's popped up. So we will stay on the line to answer that question. If there are other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, but we will gather back here on Friday at 12 noon for the second part of Lorrie's presentation. So we hope that you can join us for that. If you haven't yet registered, you may do so either on the Nonprofit Institute's website or on the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego website. And we look forward to seeing you on Friday. And so Lorrie, let me see here. The question is, how do emotion and vulnerability overlap? It is often looked down on to be too emotional in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think, emotion and vulnerability are directly connected, and a big part of courageous leadership is developing emotional intelligence. There is a whole section on kind of learning to not only understand, but name and talk about our emotions. And one of the challenges is we don't have the words to talk about our emotions to reflect the complexity that they are. What I would offer you, who asked that question, is there's an amazing podcast. So Brene has the Unlocking Us podcast, and maybe we can put a link to this, Janine, because there's some great ones that are so specific just to what we've talked about. There's one with Mark, it's Mark Brackett, who is the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence at Yale. And he has a great podcast. He just has a new book out called Permission to Feel. And his podcast with Brene is all about the book, but specifically how we can get more in touch with our emotions, giving ourselves permission to feel, but not in a way that allows us to be sloppy all over each other, but in a way that honors the feeling, but then learns to work through it. So that would be a great place to start, because absolutely you cannot separate emotion from vulnerability. So learning to navigate that would be very important. There was another question, I think, in the chat really quickly. Oh yeah, Rhea, I think you asked that question. Okay.
So we have one more in the Q&A, which is, how can we support our leaders in feeling safe to be more vulnerable? Like when they just almost get it, but their defenses come up as armor, how do we support them?
It's a great question. A couple different ways. I think if it's okay to fail, leadership and authority, it's a tricky thing to hold. It's a tricky role to hold. We have such kind of very rigid, limited expectations for our leaders. We expect them to be right. We expect them to have the answers, but we want them to be reflective. We want them to be decisive, but don't be too decisive because we're going to criticize your decision. So I think the way that we can do it is start to create a culture in general where risk-taking, being wrong is okay. If a leader does attempt to do something and maybe you realize a week later that was not the best decision, don't criticize them for it. Attempt to say like, wow, gosh, at least we now are learning from that choice and let's make a new choice. So part of it is the space to be able to make mistakes and not feel like you're going to be, we have a term, assassinated for it, right? Kind of voted off the island, because then they will be very protective. So that would be one first way, is to create a space for mistakes to happen. And then it doesn't come back to bite you anyway, right? Like, oh, you say I can make a mistake, but then I get in trouble anyway. That will not lend themselves to the courageous workplace.
So Lorrie, another question that came in is, if you're working in a male-dominated environment, what are some suggestions, other than getting an ally, to navigate making the switch from their current thinking to this concept of courageous leadership?
Great question. So one of my my main area of expertise and work is in women in leadership, gender and leadership. And so one of the things I think is really important is to fully understand gender bias, understand when it shows up, understand what it does to you. What is your reaction when that happens? So for example, I can share that I know that I am triggered by kind of that dominating kind of football coaching straight white male, because I've had some very bad experiences with them in athletics. But I know that now. I know that kind of that model or that ideal of old boys club in athletics still exists, but I can be aware of it, and I can be aware of what it does to me, so I can not react or retreat, right? So that would be the first thing. Get to understand gender bias, understand how it's showing up, understand your reaction to it. Then working with finding your voice to potentially name or call out some of the things that might be happening, right? So another example is we had a situation where we had several women and one male, and all the women were PhDs and so was the male, but then a couple colleagues were calling the women by their first names and the male by Dr. Blank, right? And it's like, well, we have PhDs too. Very subtle, right? But it's then, instead of just accepting it, it's saying, wow, I noticed that you're calling me Lorrie every time. And then in the same sentence, you're saying Dr. So-and-so. I have a PhD, right? What's that about? And doing it in a way that maybe is inviting, doing it in a way that is actually curious, not criticizing. So I think that would be a really important point, is come with curiosity, come with a genuine interest to try to make a positive change, as opposed to criticizing them for what they're doing. A lot of the research with men, there's a lot of great men in the workplaces. They don't even realize, right? Unfortunately, it's part of the system. It's part of the same kind of racial system as we have a misogynistic system still. And so we need to shift it by calling attention to it and developing that awareness. So that would be kind of what I would suggest.
All right, great. Thank you for that, Lorrie. This is a great place for us to end. We've answered everybody's questions and comments, and we will look forward to Friday. It won't be able to get here soon enough.
All right.
So we can continue this learning together. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you on Friday at noon.
All right. Take care. Thanks.